We're going to get going again. I've got my Bible. I'm going to open up here to the right book. Okay, here we go. Day number 4. Of course, I'm joined here in the studio by the very handsome Stephen Boldy. So extended greetings if you haven't already seen him. But Stephen and I are here looking at day number 4, the enemies. The enemies. Let's start like we have in the past by I'm going to real quickly hit these 5 firm footholds, these principles that we've been using based on evidence throughout the book, even evidence from our initial study in chapter 1, things that really do help us stay grounded in this book. And of course, as we've talked about before, they're not different from any other principles really that we use in general for books of the Bible, any book of the Bible. Number 1, revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ, revealed through Jesus, and Jesus is revealed through this book in unique ways and powerful ways. Number 2, revelation was given to 7 real churches. They're listed there in chapter 1. We read about them in chapters 2 and 3. They're mentioned near the end of the book as well, the churches that this book was sent to. Number 3, revelation was conveyed through symbolic numbers and images, probably the most distinctive thing that people know about Revelation, that apocalyptic, as it's called, language that's used, the style of the book that we're going to get knee deep in tonight. Number 4, revelation should always be taken as a whole. No reason to break it apart. There's no indication from the text that it should be broken into pieces. Some want to look at something in the past, and some say this part is just about the future, and we should split them up. We don't want to do that unless we find indications, evidence, clues in the text itself to do that. So we'll keep thinking about that. And number 5, revelation is meant to be kept. That's mentioned at the beginning, chapter 1, and in chapter 22, the final chapter of the book. There is a call to keep the book, which we've talked about as a unique and interesting command or encouragement to us. And we'll talk more about that tonight, especially in the section this section that we're going to be looking at. I also talked to you last time, and I thought it'd be good to go back through the common threads from chapter 2 and 3. Do you guys remember what these common threads were?
There's like multiple common threads.
Well, there's the ones that are on the screen, right? But what do these have to do with chapters 2 and 3?
They were the messages.
I just think chapters 2 and 3.
Say again, I'm sorry.
They were the messages to the churches, the reminders.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Sue. They were I think Stephen was getting to that too, that the idea that these are 5 things that we know that the 7 churches were faced with, that if we think about the book of the Revelation addressed to these churches, then we know by God's grace, this was the revelation they needed. They needed to hear from God. They needed to hear Jesus address these things that we have on the screen in front of you, what it means to conquer, because he talked a lot about the one who conquers or the one who overcomes. I will give such and such eternal reward. How to guard against compromise. There were a lot of temptations that they were facing. We're going to talk about that more tonight. The fact that God is truly in control. There was evidence in that throughout the letters that Christ was reassuring them that he had things under control, that he had the power, the omnipotence, the omniscience, the omnipresence, those divine attributes, that he had those as he walked among the lampstands, which were the churches. The promise that he was coming, he would come to them spiritually, not only to deal with in discipline with his church, but also he would come one day at the end. And that points to that last point, is the hope of consummation. That the promises given to those who would overcome were those that spoke about a time in the future in which God would do a work of bringing everything to a close. And we'll deal with that in a couple weeks, talking more about that specifically. Feel free to jump in if something pops up in your mind in terms of a question. Hopefully all of that makes sense based on what we've looked at in the past. But let's start tonight by going back and picking up with our theme from last time, which was the throne. You may recall that I shared some of these statistics with you last time, that in the New Testament, the Greek word thronos is used 61 times in the Testament. And actually, out of those 61, Revelation has 46 of those 61 in 37 verses. So 75% of all the occurrences of this word in the New Testament are in Revelation. That's a huge repository of huge statistical feature that there's so much of them, so many of them are there in Revelation. Just points to the fact that there's an emphasis on this idea of the throne, especially given that 39 of all of the New Testament usages of that word are references to God's throne in the book of the Revelation. So clearly an emphasis in that book, a major theme. But notice this, what about the other 7 throne references? Right, so there's 46 times it's used in Revelation, 39 are in reference to God's throne. What about the other 7? Well, 3 times that word is used in reference to the 24 elders. You guys may remember from chapter 4, it says they were sitting on thrones, 24 thrones, and they fell off their thrones and bowed before God, casting their crowns before God in worship. So that's 3 of those. There's also a mention, that's in chapter 20. So that's kind of one of those places where Christians will debate with one another whether those Christians reigning with Christ on thrones are reigning right now, or they will be reigning in the future. Or only reigning in the future and not now. But I think both are true in some sense. But 3 of those references usages of the word throne, enemies of God in the Revelation. Sometimes Revelation is compared to a movie. Revelation. Were you guys able to read chapters 12 through 14 and chapter 17? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. I hope that you were. Let's look at what we have here in terms of what you saw. This is what you would have seen there in those chapters. God's enemies in the Revelation are the dragon, chapter 12, the beast, chapter 13. Hold on. We've got somebody coming in, I think. Oh, Christian's coming back in. There we go. All right. Welcome back, Christian.
Sorry.
So,
it was going crazy.
Oh, I'm glad you got it worked out. I just pulled up this screen on God's enemies in the Revelation from the reading that you guys did for homework.
Okay.
So the dragon, chapter 12 is one of the enemies. The beast, chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. We also introduced in verses 11 and talked about in verses 11 through 18. And you'll see that in Revelation 16, 13, and I saw coming out of the mouth of the beast and out of the false prophet. That's another name for the second beast that is described in chapter 13. coming out of their mouth 3 unclean spirits like frogs. And then finally, the great prostitute who is mentioned, she's mentioned in chapter 7, and see if we can identify each of these enemies. Who is the dragon? Who is the beast? Who is the second beast, the false prophet? Who is the great prostitute? Sound like a plan?
You know what, Bryce? I have a question already.
Sure.
I didn't find the prostitute. I found like an image of the second beast, that he gave him all his powers and stuff, but it was the image that was made of him.
Chapter 17, are you looking at? Were you looking at? Chapter 17 is the introduction of the harlot. You'll see if you turn there.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just saying another enemy would be the image of the beast, that the beast breathed life into him. And was I reading a different book?
No, let's come back to that, Mom. You're right. You're exactly right about that. That's from chapter 13. So we'll come back to that.
So is that not considered one of the enemies?
Yeah, well, yes, but we'll talk about how that connects to what we're talking about here, okay?
Okay.
Okay, good point though. Let's take each of these one at a time, okay? Let's look at chapter 12 together. So I'd love to have maybe one of you out there read chapter 12 verses 1 through 3 for us.
I'll read it.
Thank you, Christian.
And it says, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with a moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems."
Good. What's a diadem or a diadem?
That's a crown, isn't it?
It's a crown, correct. Yeah. So seven heads, 10 horns on his heads were 7 crowns. Good. Thank you, Christian. So who is this dragon?
Not Satan.
Yes. How do we know that?
Because we do.
Because later in
I'm
this
not
chapter,
sure where, but yeah.
Look at verse 9, you guys.
Number 9.
Oh, verse 9. Yeah, that's where we know. That's how we know, Bryce.
There we go. It's on the screen for you too. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. You see that?
Yep.
So the vision, so as we read through this vision, let me give you a quick overview of the vision that we have here. So there's really no dispute about who this dragon is. It's abundantly clear. It's the devil. It just says explicitly it's the devil and Satan. But what does the vision mean in chapter 12? Well, the vision is Satan has been thrown down in light of Christ's work, the binding of the strong man, as Jesus talked about in one of the parables that he gave, of what he would do to the satanic forces. And the devil has been overcome by the preaching of the gospel. Unable to eradicate Jesus or the believing Jewish remnant, who is the woman, the devil, has put Gentile believers in his crosshairs. Did you guys get that from the reading?
Well, he waged war because he was so angry about being thrown out. He waged war. He was thrown out and down to earth, and we got him. So,
yes. Look at verse 17. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. That's an important phrase right there. The rest of her offspring. The woman, the identity of the woman is sometimes debated, but I think the best description of the fact that who would be the woman who would have more offspring? Who was the first offspring that's mentioned here of the woman?
A male child.
The male child, and we know who this male child is. Who?
Christ.
Christ. How do we know that? Verse 5.
Yeah, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron.
Yeah. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. So the exaltation of Christ, the Psalm 2, Psalm 110, this is the description of the Messiah. But we know that if she has other offspring, and given the language in chapter 12, verse 1, does that sound familiar to anybody, that idea of a woman with the sun and the moon and the stars? 12 stars?
The number 12, the 12 tribes.
Yeah, the 12 tribes. Do you guys remember where this language might come from?
Joseph's dream.
Joseph's dream.
Yeah.
Yeah. Remember one of the dreams that Joseph had? Not the one with the the sheaves bowing down, but the one with the sun, moon, and stars
Yeah.
bowing. This is probably where that language is drawn from. So this is probably, given the fact that that language is used, and given the fact that the rest of her offspring become the target of the devil, this probably represents the Jewish remnant church, the church that the early church that was primarily Jewish at the beginning. It was pretty much all Jewish except for those that Jesus maybe administered to and had been kind of brought in. And then eventually God-fearers came in the book of Acts, became more connected. And then full out Gentiles were connected as we read in the book of Acts. But of course, the devil did everything to try to crush the early church, didn't he? Through all sorts of persecutions, and eventually to destroy Jerusalem itself through the Romans. So the preservation of the early Jewish remnant was something that is talked about outside the Bible as well. Some of the Jewish Christians who survived AD 70 and the attack of the Romans. But having failed in that mission, the devil now this vision describes him as going after her other offspring, who would be who?
Us.
Yeah, all the Gentile believers, right?
Yeah.
The Gentile believers came to faith because of the faithfulness of Jewish teachers like Peter and Paul, for example, right?
Right.
And others like in Acts chapter 8, when it's after the persecution of Stephen, it said that many went from Jerusalem after the persecution. They were driven out, and they went preaching the Lord Jesus. So that seems to be what this vision is describing. I know there's probably lots of little things you could probably say, what does that mean? What part does that mean? What does that mean? But I just want you to see in general, that's what's going on here. The opposition of the devil against these believers. Now, we already know about this, don't we? Because take a look at this screen. Remember this, many of those in the 7 churches, as we saw from chapters 2 and 3, faced opposition from so-called Jews who in reality belonged to a synagogue of Satan. Chapter 2, verse 9, chapter 3, verse 9. Some of these Christians were also dealing with the kind of cancerous false teaching that Jesus described as the deep things of Satan. Chapter 2, verse 24. More than that, some of these disciples were feeling pressure from the civil authorities Jesus designated Satan's throne in chapter 2, verse 13. So this is not surprising that we're reading about satanic opposition, right? And what's at work, because it's already been clear that there's a lot of satanic opposition that these churches are facing in chapters 2 and 3. Jesus is again pulling back the veil to kind of show us what's going on. That's what apocalypsis means. It means the pulling back of a veil to reveal something. Now let's take a look at Revelation. Now that we've identified the dragon, let's identify the beast. Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Who would like to read those verses?
Which one? 13?
Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 13. Have you got those, Mom?
I got it. I got
Okay.
it. And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and his great authority.
Great. Thank you very much. So you may or may not know that the description there in 13:1 points us back to Daniel chapter 7. In one sense, you may want to make a note of this, but in one sense, Revelation is just an expanded commentary on Daniel chapter 7. So, yeah, it really is. The whole book is really just taking Daniel 7 and kind of totally pulling it apart, like expanding it out and filling in a lot of things. So if you've never read through Daniel chapter 7 or haven't in a while, go back and you will see exactly what I'm talking about. But if you remember in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel had a vision of 4 beasts coming out of the sea. So he sees there 4 beasts, and those beasts in Daniel 7 are exactly what we see in verse 2 here. There was a lion, there was a bear, and there was a leopard. And then there was a 4th beast. But Daniel sees 4 beasts with a total of 7 heads, which is interesting. He sees 2 beasts with 1 head. He sees another beast with 4 heads. The leopard had 4 heads, and that was because Alexander the Great's kingdom would be divided between 4 of his generals. So the book of Daniel later explains that in detail. That's why the leopard, who represents Greece and Alexander, has 4 heads. So there's 6 heads, and then there's a beast, a 4th beast. It's not said how many heads the 4th beast of Daniel 7 actually has, but the reader just assumes that he has 1 head because it doesn't say that he has multiple heads. So there's 7 heads right there. But what we do learn about the 4th beast in Daniel's vision is that it has 10 horns. These beasts, as you'll see on the screen, clearly represent conquering, ruling worldly powers. It begins with Babylon, then it continues on. The next beast represents the Medo-Persian Empire that overtook Babylon, the Persians. And then the 3rd beast representing the Greek Empire under Alexander's leadership as conqueror. And then the 4th beast is not named, or there's no real clues given in the book. But historically speaking, if we follow that progression, where do we end up? Who is the 4th beast?
The United States.
Yes,
Donald Trump.
exactly. Donald Trump.
Amen, Brother Steve.
I couldn't resist. I was waiting for that one.
No.
Good job.
Who defeated the Greeks?
Could it be the Romans?
It was the Romans. Yes.
Oh, I got it right.
Yeah. So good job, Steve. The succession of these kingdoms in Daniel points to Rome as Daniel's 4th beast with 10 horns. So Rome, of course, was the ruling power at the time of the New Testament. It was the ruling power over the lives of those in the 7 churches. Those 7 churches existed in a province, a Roman province called Asia Minor. We already know all that from the beginning of the book and chapters 2 and 3. So we know this about the beast that's described here. The beast is given satanic support. And to it, the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. So there's another use of the word throne, one of the three in reference to the enemies of God. We hear about Satan's throne. We also saw Satan's throne back in chapter 2. We'll come up to that again in just a second. But did you notice that Satan was described in chapter 12 as a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns? Then we see this beast is described as one with 7 heads and 10 horns. So the 10 horns do connect us back to the 4th beast of Daniel 7, but he also seems to be a combination of the beasts, right? This beast seems to be a combination of the beasts that are described in Daniel 7. As the ruler of this world, talking now about the dragon or Satan, as the ruler of this world, John chapter 12, verse 31, as Jesus describes the devil, and as Paul describes it as the God of this age, 2 Corinthians 4:4, Satan gave Rome worldwide power and influence, as well as the means to persecute the church. We see that all throughout chapter 13. References to the world abound. Now, does that throw us off a little bit when we talk about worldwide power and influence?
I don't know. I think like the idea of Babylon being used.
Oh, hold on to Babylon though. We'll get to that.
Yeah, but no, I think like just kind of the just like the patterns in the world systems that kind of carry over from age to or time to time.
What I mean, but would it be strange to talk about Rome as having worldwide influence?
No,
Why not?
it's because they were like the most influential like government in the world. You know, I mean, like obviously not in like South America, but the known world at the time, or like the
Yeah. Did you guys hear what Stephen was saying?
Barely.
Okay. We're talking about this question of Rome having worldwide power. If that sits funny with you, because of course Rome did not have global power in 2,000 years ago, right?
Right.
What we have to understand though is the language that's used here in this description. If you look back at chapter 12, verse 9, it says that the devil is the deceiver of the whole world. Do you see that? That word "world" there is not the word Gaia, which is the planet Earth. It's not the world. It's not the word cosmos, which means the world. Like when we talk about loving the world and the things of the world, not loving the things of the world. That's the word cosmos. This is a different word altogether. It's a word called oikos mene, and it means the inhabited world. It's the same exact word that was used in Luke chapter 2 when it says that Caesar Augustus ordered that a census should be taken of the whole world.
Right.
Now, was that global?
no.
No, of course not. It was the whole world in terms of the whole Roman Empire. So do not let anybody tell you who's trying to argue for a position on Revelation that none of this could be true unless we're talking about some future civilization in which there's global trade, global commerce, global communication, global power and influence. That's just not how the writer and his readers would have thought. A word like oikomene means the Roman Empire, the inhabited world, the world as they knew it. Does that make sense, everybody?
Mm-hmm.
So we see here that the beast's antagonism toward God and his people is also clear from the use of the word blasphemy. You see it used in some form in verse 1, verse 5, verse 6. So there's no doubt about the fact that this beast is a world power, a conquering and ruling power. Given what we see about them persecuting the people of God and the satanic inspiration behind that, and the satanic role in giving authority, the readers would have clearly understood this to be the Roman authorities, this picture here.
Yeah, would this dragon have been at work against Israel, ancient Israel, or Israel before Christ?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I don't think that's in the scope of chapter 12.
Yeah.
But we do know that Satan was at work. We see him
Yeah.
trying to deceive, tempting David. We see in the book of
Census,
Job.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a number of places where he pops up. And if the reference to the ancient serpent in 12:9 is a reference to the Garden of Eden, which it most likely is, then of course he goes all the way back to that initial temptation and deception. So let's keep going here with the beast. Remember this, as we talk about these blasphemous names, Joy read for us that the beast in chapter 13, verse 1 had blasphemous names on its head. You may have wondered what those were. I think they were the titles that the Roman emperors gave themselves. Here's some of them right here. They called themselves Kurios, Lord, Soter, Savior, Didyphilius, Son of God, Sebastos, one to be revered, and they called themselves Divos, Deus, and Theos, God. So all these titles that we know are appropriately and only rightly applied to God, these emperors would use for themselves. Now, let's try to identify the second beast, the false prophet, in chapter 13, verses 11 and 12. Stephen, would you read those for us?
Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed.
Very good. Who might this be, this beast? Anybody have any ideas?
Interesting. I
What-
don't know.
What's his relationship to the first beast?
He has its authority.
Right?
He makes the inhabitants worship the first beast.
Okay. So if we identify the first beast with the Roman Empire and the emperor, kingdom and king, like we see in Daniel 7, kingdom and king, if we have the kingdom of Rome and then we have the emperor as the king, we're talking about some entity that is promoting worship of the beasts, right? Do we have anything like that in history?
I don't know. It was like culture, like the centurions, like,
Well, let me tell you about it a little bit. Notice the goal of the beast is clear, like Stephen was pointing out, to promote worship of the first beast. The first readers would have recognized this very quickly as the imperial cult, is what it was called. The imperial cult. The imperial cult was a system of temples that promoted the adoration of the Roman gods and the Roman emperors. Now, the question we would ask then would be something like, okay, if this was a system that was empire-wide at the time of the writing of Revelation, was the imperial cult active in Asia, the province that we're talking about, where the 7 churches were located? Listen to this. This is from Stephen Friesen. He's done a lot of great work. He's out of UT Austin, studied at Harvard, though. Listen to this quote. Domitian, the emperor, approved an unprecedented third provincial cult of the emperor for Asia in the 80s of the first century. very near the time of the production of the book of Revelation. No other province in the entire Roman Empire can be shown to have had even 2 such cults at the time when Asia received this 3rd one, and several provinces had no provincial cults for the emperors. That's staggering. The very place that we're talking about in throughout the entire Roman Empire, the one little place that we're focused on, which is the province of Asia Minor, had 3 imperial cult centers. And not even one other province in the entire Roman Empire even had 2. Many had 1, some had none. So I just want you guys to understand, historically speaking, this place was a hotbed for emperor worship. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
These guys would have understood that. Of course, they lived it every day. So if we read Revelation 2:13, let me read that real quick. We're going back to the letters of the churches. Revelation 2:13 is very interesting. It says this: I know, Jesus says, I know where you dwell. I know where Satan's throne is. Yet you hold fast my name, and you did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. Pretty interesting. There's 2 references to Satan in one verse. Notice this about, here's some information that I'm pulling from a message that I gave on the church at Pergamum. Pergamum was for many years the provincial Roman capital of Asia, And even though the capital was moved to Ephesus before the time of Revelation, it remained the most important center of the Roman emperor cults. In fact, Pergamum was the very first city in the entire Roman Empire to worship the Roman emperor. It eventually had several temples dedicated to different emperors. So not a surprise at all that Jesus uses this language where he talks about where Satan's throne is and where Satan dwells, because Pergamum was the absolute epicenter of imperial cult worship. Now, here's what we need to know about chapter 13. Through either mystical deception or economic pressure, the civic and cult leaders, all of whom were deeply entangled in these societies in these cities, worked very hard to maintain community-wide allegiance to Rome and her emperors. So can you guys imagine living in that kind of a environment? Living in that kind of culture where so much stress is put on worshiping the emperor as a sign of your patriotism, your allegiance.
Yeah, I wonder, like DES offices and stuff, where they're, but for Roman emperor worship.
Enforcement. And these were connected with the guilds too. So if you were a tradesman, the guilds were deeply connected. They'd also have connection with both the temples to the pagan gods and to the imperial cult temples. Guys, is all of this making sense?
Yeah, I love the background of this, but now I'm intrigued. Why Pergamum?
What's that?
Why Pergamum? Why did emperor worship? Was it first established or seen in Pergamum? Why there over Rome, the city itself? I wonder what the backstory is to all of that.
That's a great question. I put that screen back up, Steve, that says Pergamum was for many years the provincial Roman capital of Asia. So it was before it was ever an imperial cult center. It was a political center, a military center. I would guess, given the different pressures that existed within the empire, I would guess that one of these further flung provinces did something like this in order to affirm their allegiance, in order to ingratiate themselves with far off Rome in order to prove how super patriotic they were. That might be the case, or it might have something to do with that province of Asia Minor, its historical roots. They may have worshipped their kings before, whoever was the local kings. So it was natural for them to worship leaders, deify leaders like that. I don't know.
I think you're onto something when you use the word ingratiating. I could just see, provincial leaders say, get back to Rome, look at this, hear about the great temple I built for you here, and then boom, they become, a major trade route because money is the great idol, the great god in Rome.
Yeah. They definitely want Rome's investment in their communities. Okay, let's move on here. So hopefully those three, the dragon, the beast, and the second beast, or the false prophet. Sorry, can you give me a glass of water, Stephen?
Yeah.
I'm getting a dry throat here. Hopefully you guys can see that that if you were a member of one of these 7 churches, our original audience in Revelation, that the identity in light of these visions would not be so mysterious to you. That all of the information is given there for the first readers, if we understand their culture, to identify. Thank you, Stephen. To identify exactly what's going on. Now, remember, Jesus is talking in chapters 4 through the end of the book. He's talking about the things that are to come. Remember that? Describing the vision, he says in chapter 1, the things that you've seen, the things that are, and the things that are to come or to take place after this. So part of what he's describing is an intensification of the kinds of pressures and persecution that they had already seen to a certain degree. I don't have it on my slide, but did you notice when Stephen read, he talked about, or I think it was, Stephen just talked about the first beast whose mortal wound was healed. You see that in 13:12. Any idea what that means?
I don't know. It's like a supernatural, I don't know.
Well, remember, we're gonna try to translate the visionary language, the symbolic images, over to what they might mean in the real world.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think like an imperial cult.
Well, remember that it's the first beast who had a mortal wound and yet was healed. So that means Rome, something happened to the Roman Empire that seemed to mark its demise, and yet it bounced back. Does that make sense, you guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we know exactly what he's talking. We know exactly what he's talking about here. The Emperor Nero committed suicide in the 60s, so only 20 years or so before the writing of Revelation. For 1 year, the Roman Empire fell into civil war with the succession of 3 different emperors within the span of 12 months. That was the end of what was called the Julian Claudio line. So the Julian Claudio line was the only emperors that the Romans had ever known. And the only thing that brought it out of that tailspin was the rise of Vespasian. And Vespasian established a new line of emperors called the Flavian line. You may have heard of some of these titles and names, but it was Vespasian and his sons, Domitian and Tiberius, I believe. I think. Domitian is probably the emperor who is actually alive right when John is writing it. Around 90.
90.
Yeah. So that's exactly, I think, what's being described when it talks about how it had this mortal wound and was healed.
Yeah, but so the mortal wound and it being healed with Nero in 60, this was written in 90. So you think it's just
Well, yeah.
a reference to that?
It's a reference to what had happened a couple decades earlier, that it looked like Rome was going to fall because of civil war infighting. But then it was brought back by Vespasian, who brought unity again to the empire and stability, much needed stability. So those are scary times for people.
Yeah. So they would have been the readers of this. They would have known like
They would have known how people promoted that as the greatness of Rome, the glory of Rome, power of Rome.
yeah, the time it almost collapsed.
Yes. Guys, does that make sense? My digital friends?
I don't know.
Yeah. What's that?
I think you kind of lost me, but go ahead.
Where did I lose you?
I that whole last spiel, yeah.
Well, the last little bit, it was just about in chapter 13, verse 12. It mentions that the beast had a mortal wound that was healed.
Right.
That's actually a reference to earlier, to look at chapter 13, verse 3. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast.
Mhm.
So if we translate that into political, historical, real life events that are being described here by the symbolic images, I believe, Mom, what that's a reference to is the fact that Rome, the Emperor Nero in the 60s, killed himself. And after that, the empire fell into civil war for a year.
Okay.
And it looked like the empire was in a tailspin and was going to eventually fall apart.
Okay.
But a man named Vespasian became the new emperor and established a new line of emperors. And one of those one of his sons is actually the emperor while John's writing this book of the Revelation.
Huh.
So what seemed to be marked the end of the Roman Empire was actually, Vespasian pulled it out and actually brought stability to the empire and kind of a new glory and a new power to the empire.
Can you spell that? Vespasian? What?
Vespasian, V as in Victor,
Oh,
Vespasian.
gotcha.
Yeah,
Thank you.
the Emperor Vespasian. So let's move on from that and look at this the great prostitute. Would somebody out there read Revelation 17 verses 1 through 6 for us?
I can do that.
Thank you.
1 through 6. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk." And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus.
Thank you, Steve. Notice when we identify who is this prostitute?
Yeah. Is the prostitute a separate entity from the dragon? Are these two different things?
What do you guys think? Is the prostitute separate from the dragon?
Yeah.
Yes, I believe that she is.
Yeah.
Is she separate from the beast?
Yes, isn't it Babylon? The mother of harlot? Isn't that who it is?
So on her forehead's the name, right? Of Mystery Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of the
Right.
earth's abominations. So she's referred to as that. She's referred to that from there on out. You talk about how she's referred to as the harlot. She's referred to as Babylon. Notice in chapter 17, notice in chapter 16, in verse 19, it says, God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. Now look over at chapter 14. And in chapter 14, it says in verse 8, another angel, a second followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all the nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual morality. So she's already introduced in the book, right?
Yeah.
Chapter 14, chapter 16. Now in 17, we're actually getting like a fuller explanation. Like, hey, you know what? It's almost like God is saying, or the angel is saying, hey, you know, I mentioned Babylon the Great before a couple times. Let me tell you a little bit more about who this is.
Is it an invisible spiritual person?
Well, she's a representation. She's a symbolic representation. We see the name Babylon. Look at verse 18. Chapter 17 is pretty cool because it has a lot of explanations. It's probably the chapter that has the most interpretive clues, or just straight out, here's a translation of the apocalyptic language. Here's what the symbols mean. Verse 18, the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. So the woman is a city, and that city has dominion over the kings of the earth. There can be no doubt about who that is.
Like the Roman.
Yeah, Rome, right?
Yeah.
I will tell look at verses 7 and 9. I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated.
Would you say it's like unbridled human power and passion? Like,
Well, hold on a minute. We're going to get to that. Now, notice that last description I just gave you from verse 9, you guys. Talks about the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Take a look at this coin right here. Stephen, look at this. Guess who minted this coin? Vespasian.
What?
This is a coin from Vespasian. This is circa 71 AD. This is not an unusual image. This is a fairly common image. It has the goddess Roma, Dea Roma, and she is seated on the 7 mountains or hills on which Rome is built. You can see below that the she-wolf that suckled Romulus and Remus, who were the mythical founders of the city, is seen at the very bottom left-hand corner above Roma. And it also bears the mark of SC Senatus Consultus. It means that the Senate has decreed and authorized this coinage. But that is a pretty amazing image, isn't it?
yeah.
Because that image is pretty much what we just heard about here. And this would have been a very familiar image to the first readers of Revelation. Now, the 7 mountains that are described that are mentioned in verse 9, this calls for a mind with wisdom. That's usually how John says, hey, think about this in terms of apocalyptic imagery. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. The 7 heads are also 7 kings. So mountains do represent, in apocalyptical imagery, they do represent power like we see in the Old Testament. But I think he's also saying here that isn't it interesting that these are 7 mountains, but there's also 7 kings, like the beast has 7 heads. So the number 7 is a number of perfection or completion or wholeness. So it's talking about the totality, the completeness of the Roman leadership, the emperors as the leaders of Rome. Now, so the question then becomes, is the prostitute the same as the beast? In the image, is she identified as the beast? Separate, but what's her relationship in the image to the beast? What do you see spatially, in terms of the imagery?
The beast, I don't know.
She's where? She's
seated on many waters. From the kings of the earth who have committed sexual immorality. Yeah.
Well, verse 3, it says that she's sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. So she's seated on top of the beast. And wherever the beast goes, she goes. So wherever the beast is, the influence of the woman is as well. So let me clarify this with a statement here. Just try to help us kind of understand how this imagery works together. Her power, if you read through chapter 17, her power is not like the beast. That is, it does not express itself in political pressure, military might, or cultural coercion, but instead in sensuality and seduction. She is the one with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. What does that mean? Well, throughout Revelation, sexual immorality represents not only physical compromise, but all kinds of compromise. Those who are virgins, remember the virgins who were with the Lamb in chapter 14, the followers of the Lamb, they were virgins. It meant there was a purity that they hadn't compromised.
Purity.
Yeah. So all the compromise that's described here through any fleshly desire, right? Compromise through fleshly desires leads us away from God and toward the beast. So let's talk about this. Go ahead. Did somebody out there have a comment? No? Okay. Let's talk about the 7 churches and God's enemies. So if the woman represents Rome, and Rome as a cultural center, a lifestyle inspiring presence that basically exports the Roman life, and the Roman life with all of its compromise, then we have a picture here that bringing all of these 4 enemies together, I think that we can say this, based on chapter 2 and 3, these churches were experiencing satanic opposition. We know that already. We saw that in chapters 2 and 3. This satanic opposition, bullet point number 2, the Roman government had and would continue to persecute Christians for their faith. The Christians were beginning to suffer under Nero, and it just got worse under Domitian and those who came after him. So satanic opposition, that satanic power was being felt through the Roman government. Point number 3, these Christians dealt with civic and commercial pressure to conform, often tied to the influence of the imperial cults. So your community, your trade guild, life in your community, commerce in your community was often tied to your allegiance and how well you showed your patriotic spirit. I want to give you a quote. This is from only 20 years after the writing of Revelation. But just listen to, these are the words of a Roman himself, and it does not get much clearer than what I've been describing for you tonight. Are you ready? This is from the very famous letter of Pliny, the Roman magistrate. I think Pliny the Younger. He had a famous father as well. He's writing to the Emperor Trajan, and he's writing from the exact area that we're talking about from Asia Minor in 112 AD. This is what he says to the Emperor Trajan about Christians and prosecuting the crime of being a Christian. He says, soon accusations spread, as usually happens because of the proceedings going on. Read their Salem witch trials, that kind of stuff's going on. People start accusing one another for all sorts of nasty reasons, right? None based on the truth. And several incidents occurred, says Pliny. An anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, and they offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, Emperor Trajan, which I had ordered be brought for this purpose. They brought an image, a statue of the emperor, to prove whether or not these were Christians, these people were actually Christian. They had offered these prayers with incense and wine to the image that he had brought in, together with statues of the gods, and moreover, they cursed Christ, none of which, says Pliny, those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. These, I thought, should be discharged.
That's like,
Brothers and sisters, it doesn't get any clearer than that, does it? This is what our spiritual ancestors had to deal with. This is what the people in Asia Minor, just 2 decades, 20 years after the writing of Revelation, were facing in regard to being accused of a crime for being a Christian. And they were pressured to offer prayers and offerings to the gods of Rome and do obeisance before the image of the emperor. Now, Mom, you mentioned the image of the beast. Do you remember that?
Yes.
So I think this is exactly what we're talking about. This idea that the second beast, the false prophet, that represents the symbolic representation of the imperial cult, the emperor worship movement, they were promoting the worship of Rome and the worship of the emperor. That's exactly what was going on. So the image is not really a separate enemy. It's just an image of the second enemy, which is the beast itself. And it's a tool. It's a tool of the who is the false prophet, which is the imperial cults. Now, guys, does all of this make sense to you? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, lots of information, lots of threads,
Yes.
but it's very fascinating, and yeah, it does start to get a flow to it as you read through it and go back and forth. I like this.
Yeah, that's what I want you to be. Let me give you one last point in terms of the 7 churches. Remember the last bullet point there, these believers were also tempted by the Roman lifestyle of immorality, sensuality, and materialism. So the striking thing to me is that so many of the misreadings of Revelation somehow just miss this information, which has been readily available for hundreds and hundreds of years. There was knowledge of what was going on with the Roman Empire all the way back to the scholastics in the medieval times.
yeah. Are there like older teachers who would, kind of be on the same page as what, you're going?
I don't know. I'd have to go back and I'd be interested in some of the reformers. I know they tied some of it with the Catholic Church because they saw the direct historical connections between the city of Rome
Yeah, that's true.
and what the church had become in
The
the
Antichrist.
Roman system. Yeah, absolutely. But it's so interesting that these misreadings of Revelation just miss the fact that so much of this is completely understandable by just using the same toolbox that we always use for the rest of the Bible, which is going back and understanding who the readers were, the first recipients, and what kind of situation they were facing. And when you understand that, all of this completely begins just to make sense in a way that it just does not in other systems. In other systems, it's stretched to the point of being unbelievable. It's stretched to the point of not making much sense,
Wild.
how this is applied to certain things. But this is the revelation that these believers needed. So those 4 points that you see on the screen there in terms of what we knew already, we already knew those 4 first bullet points from chapters 2 and 3. And what we're seeing in chapters 12 through 14 and chapter 17, what we're seeing is more explanation given to who is standing behind what they are experiencing, the spiritual reality behind what's happening, and a scary promise about the intensification of what they're going to have to face. So those 4 points represent the four enemies that we see right there at the bottom: the dragon, the beast, the false prophet, and the prostitute. The dragon, satanic, demonic influence; the beast, political oppression, social violence; the false prophet, conformity to the imperial cult, commercial civic pressure; and the prostitute, the sensuality and seduction, immorality, the promise of pleasure and possessions and position in society. Now, what about us? What about us? We might think, well, what does this have to do with us then? If this is all about like what happened in the in the 1st century and the 2nd century with these Christians under the Roman Empire, what about us? Well, take a look at this. Daniel 7:7. It was different from all the beasts that were before, and it had 10 horns. That's the beast that we talked about, the 4th beast, if you recall. Revelation chapter 12, verse 3, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. Revelation 13:1, a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads. And of course, we heard about the same beast that was ferrying around the prostitute in chapter 17. What I want you guys to see, though, is the fact that the 4th beast of Daniel is seen now as the great red dragon. Satan is described with the same power or the same attributes. And then the beast, Rome, is described with those same attributes. Then in Isaiah 21, verse 9, if we were to go back there, we would read, fallen is Babylon, says the crier or the messenger. But in Revelation 14:8, we read the same thing. Fallen is Babylon the Great. The point of this is that we are seeing a conflation, conflation, conflation of a lot of these images as applying to different things. The beasts in Daniel represent different successive empires: Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. We see the dragon is embodying all of these and standing behind Rome. The 10 horns are consistent. We know, we'll get to that in just a minute, but that has kind of a connection between Daniel, what Daniel saw, and Revelation. We also know there's a connection between Babylon that once existed long ago in Mesopotamia, but now the cry is repeated in Revelation, fallen is Babylon the Great, which doesn't make any sense if it's talking about literal Babylon. But because the woman is called Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes, there clearly is a direct connection being made to everything that Babylon stood for in the past and what Rome was now standing for in the present. Right? Both were oppressors of God's people. Both were regal and royal, but they were full of immorality and sorcery and deception. And so there's just a number of parallels that we see. All of this is simply to say that, as Paul would describe for us in Ephesians, for one of these churches, one of the 7 churches, Ephesus, Paul wrote to them and said, "We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Now, notice that rulers and authorities there are not people, are they? They're not ultimately people, because he said we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. But rulers and authorities are described as, look at the different names he gives these spiritual entities: rulers and authorities, cosmic powers, and spiritual forces of evil. Those are all describing the same thing, exactly what we see with Revelation 12 and 13. That is Satan at work behind the scenes, pulling the strings, inspiring the institutions of sinners, sinful men, like the Romans, like the Babylonians, like the Persians, like the Greeks. That make sense?
Yeah.
So rulers and authorities is a name. Sometimes the word throne is used, thrones. These are names for demonic hierarchies. This is basically Satan's network of those who follow him in the spiritual realm. But look at this beautiful statement from Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. God made us alive together with him, with Christ, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed, in that work, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. That is, God disarmed them, put them to open shame, and triumphed over these demonic forces in Christ. That's exactly what chapter 12 talked about, how they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony.
Yes, amen.
So these are the authorities, these are the demonic forces behind. Now, look at this verse from 1 John. You know it well, verses 15 through 17 of 1 John 2. Remember, this is John, the one who's the revelator, right? He's the one that we're reading, who's taken the vision in the book of Revelation. He writes, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world," and of course we know we're not talking about the planet Earth, and not just talking about people on the planet Earth, we're talking about something else, some kind of a system.
The present evil age.
The present evil age, exactly. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, here's what defines the world: the desires of the flesh, desires of the eyes, and the pride of life. Boy, that sounds like a woman that we've just read about. Mm-hmm. This is not from the Father, but is from the world, and the world is passing away, Amen, along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever. Brothers and sisters, that's exactly what Revelation is describing for us in extended apocalyptic language. The world is passing away. Along with its desires, the woman will be judged and overcome. How do we stand firm? For everyone who has been born of God, 1 John chapter 5, verse 4, overcomes the world. Overcomes, the same word used to conquer, the same word used for conquering in all the letters to the churches of Revelation. He who conquers. Same word, overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Do these themes sound familiar?
Yeah, wonderful, beautiful tie-ins.
Yeah, these are the same themes in Revelation. So what about us is the question today? Well, no matter the when or where, the dragon is always using some beast and false prophet to oppress God's people and or a prostitute to seduce them with worldly pleasure, position, prestige, etc. And I think that's built into the vision that John is giving here, is that though the first readers would have seen Rome and understood Rome to be described there, the language also helps us understand that it's much bigger than any one empire. There's something bigger happening. So when we think about this, you guys, what we've seen here tonight, I think that brings us back to foothold number 5. Revelation is meant to be kept. Because if we recognize the fact that the beast is at work, the dragon is at work even today, using some beast and false prophet to oppress God's people. He's using some prostitute to seduce them with worldly pleasure, position, prestige, etc. Then that means that you and I have to be on our guard. We have to know what it means to conquer. We have to guard against compromise. Now look at these incredible encouragements that are given to us in the chapters that we looked at tonight, thinking about this idea of keeping the revelation. Chapter 12, verse 11, and they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Have we conquered by the blood of the Lamb?
Yeah.
Amen. The word of our testimony, the preaching of the gospel, our confession of Christ, even to the point where we would die daily or give up our physical lives. This is a call to endurance. Chapter 13, verse 10. Here's a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. That's John breaking in. That's John writing as he's dictating the vision. As he's trying to describe what he's seen there. He stops and says, hey, listen, this is a call for endurance and faith. Okay, what I'm describing here about the beast and the persecution that the beast is bringing, please, brothers and sisters, arm yourself to persevere. Don't give up. Don't give in. Then in 13:18, after the false prophet is described, the second beast who calls for the worship of the beast, he says this calls for wisdom, says John. There's that same phrase. This calls for wisdom. Think about what I'm saying in apocalyptic language. Translate that into action, brothers and sisters. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. That is one less than the number of God, 3 times confirmed. That is, the beast is simply a man who is sinful and unholy. He is not what he claims to be. He is not God. Therefore, do not identify yourself with him. Do not bow before him. Do not offer prayers to him. Do not sacrifice to him. Do not compromise your faith in one Lord, Jesus Christ, one God and Father, in order to get along better in the marketplace. Don't, when you're pressed and pressured, don't give in to that. Don't receive that mark. That is, don't be identified along with the world and the imperial cult and all these pressures just so you can do business better, so you can get ahead in this or that way. Do not receive that mark. Because you have been sealed, like we saw in chapter 7, you have been sealed with the mark of God. He has put his mark on you, and your name is written in the Lamb's book of life. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints. He says again in chapter 14, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And then in chapter 18, verse 4, after the description of the harlot Babylon, who is Rome, the city of the represents this world system, taken with the world system. He says, "Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues." Those all apply to us, you guys. Those are all things that we need to hear in light of this.
Amen.
Now, here's how I want to encourage you. What I find really interesting, especially when you think about the woman, the harlot, the prostitute. What I find interesting is that so many times you'll meet people who talk about Revelation and they warn us about, for example, the mark of the beast is a great example of this. There are people today, and some of you know people like this today, who truly believe that the mark of the beast may be some kind of microchip put in your head or your hand, right? Have you heard this before?
Yeah.
Yes. They are looking towards a future in which some totalitarian big brother using technological oppression is going to try to make us compromise our faith. But what they have missed is the fact that the devil and his schemes are much more subtle than that. They are guarding themselves against some future of an antichrist with microchips, when in fact it could be that the prostitute has already made the inroads into their life that they don't even suspect, that they don't even see, that they are ethically compromising themselves, they are living worldly lives, and they are believing that they are safe, and they've completely missed the message of Revelation. Because they have been foolishly misled by poor teachers. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, like not really thinking about like their lives as Christians, like guarding, and like purity and integrity and
Yeah, and everything that was being described by these enemies of God. Yes, there was persecution that happened on a civic level. There was actual death, like Antipas and others, and we get worse. We don't have that in our culture, but we certainly have plenty of opportunities to be persecuted in many ways. We feel social pressure as Christians, and that's going to intensify. We are tempted to compromise in multiple ways every single day.
Yeah, especially like I think like just being obedient and wanting to honor Christ in everything. Like it seems like being around a group of people, and after a while, like people start thinking like, what's like up with this guy? Like something's like that's kind of weird, and you get, you definitely get a little attention for,
Yes.
being like wanting to honor Christ and all the things that you do.
Right, which can be a wonderful thing because it gives us opportunity to speak about our faith.
Yeah, and then also just kind of being able to show like that life. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of radical different over time.
But this is also versus the fantastical interpretation of the book of Revelation that almost puts the warnings into another category of like, oh, that's going to happen in this fantastical time of all these crazy things happening, airplanes crashing into the ground, and we're going to spot this, and this crazy thing is going to happen, microchips and all of this stuff. It's almost completely disassociated from real life.
Yeah.
And that is the danger of that kind of understanding, is that when you misunderstand and twist the scriptures, you are missing the whole import, like the exhortation of the book of Revelation, which is all about, like we see in chapters 2 and 3, all about real Christians dealing with everyday problems that we have mirrored in our own life, of being tempted to compromise, of materialism, of being quiet and ashamed of the gospel, of losing our fervor for Christ.
Yeah,
you know, all of those things. And that's why it's so important to get this right and try to help people understand that there's a right and a wrong way to understand this book. And hopefully from what you guys have seen tonight, this is all making sense and kind of a duh when you read it, like, okay, yeah, boy, that does makes absolute sense. What are some comments from you guys as we wrap things up? You guys want to unmute if you have any thoughts or questions? What did I say that didn't make sense? Where do you want to chime in?
Okay, I could have a can of worms here, but
Okay.
Do you not believe that there is a time coming when there could be a chip or it could be some other thing that is a mark that will inhibit Christians, or anyone who doesn't have one, to buy or sell, which is what it says, you know, to buy or sell or to have anything. Basically, they're homeless, they're in poverty. Do you not see that as a literal thing?
No, I do not. I do not see that. Now, could that be a possibility someplace, somewhere, in terms of how a political entity wants to try to keep Christians in line or make them conform? Sure, that's a possibility, but that is not what this verse is saying. This verse is talking about a reality that was true for the first readers of Revelation. That is the way in which the imperial cult and allegiance to Rome was interwoven into the very civic and commercial life of the believers, from the marketplace to to the trade guilds that they were a part of, to any community event, whatever it might be. They could be pushed out of the marketplace. They could be pushed out of making a decent living if they were not willing to compromise in terms of their trade guild. I mean, can you imagine going to a company picnic and there was illicit sex going on at the company picnic that you had to engage in to be able to worship the goddess Aphrodite or Venus? That's the kind of stuff that people were pressured to do. That is, that they would compromise morally to show that they were willing to honor the goddess or the emperor who was the patron of this or that guild, artisans guild. So in the context, the original context, this makes complete sense. And we know, of course, like I said, that even though this has an application that we want to start with in terms of the initial readers of the book, we also know that the world system, that the devil is working through the world system in every generation, and that for every generation, there has always been a mark of the beast. There has always been a way that Christians are called to identify themselves, to compromise and identify themselves with the world instead of Jesus. And yes, they will have to suffer. They might have to suffer a loss of a job. They might have to suffer being socially ostracized. That's been true for the last 2,000 years. And that is exactly what this is speaking to. For a misreading, a false system of interpretation that tries to isolate a verse like this to some very specific future situation where there's the danger of actually interpreting it too literally, it just misses the whole import of the exhortation for 2,000 years of the Christian church. That's the whole danger of that futurist system of interpretation of Revelation, is that it just turns the book into something that's not really even relevant for most of us. It hasn't been relevant maybe for the 2,000 years of the church. But I'm just simply trying to show that if we just use the same tools that we apply to every other book, if we understand the historical situation of the initial readers, this makes absolute sense. And it makes much better sense than some other kind of idea that's maybe too literal that's kind of forced onto the text. Does that make sense, Mom?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions, you guys, or thoughts?
I'm saving it for next week.
Okay. All right.
Bryce, I had a question, or I
Yeah,
mean a
go-
comment.
Okay, go ahead.
All of this persecution or restriction that we're seeing described here in Revelation, I'm wondering, is some of that is some of what we see, especially in the persecuted church overseas, where people are standing up for their faith and losing their job or losing their homes? Could that be a precursor of what we read in Revelation?
Well, it's not actually a precursor. It's actually like an echo of the original setting, because the original setting was 2,000 years ago with these 7 churches who were beginning to experience a taste of what's being described here. But God is warning them. Remember the use of the word soon throughout the book. These things are taking place soon. He's warning them that there is a coming intensification of the kind of social pressure, ostracism, sacrifice, loss, martyrdom that's going to that had already taken place in a little ways here and there. It was going to get much worse for them, and of course, history bears that out, that was the case. What you're describing today is the fact that for 2,000 years, for 1,900 years after the time of the 7 churches of Revelation, we've been seeing that same kind of pattern, which is the very thing we would expect to see, because the dragon is still at work through some beast and false prophet or some prostitute to tempt and to oppress the people of God, so that there are still temptations to receive a mark of the beast, that is identification with the world system, compromise before governing authorities who are corrupt, compromise of your faith in Christ. So that's what we should expect for these last days. That's what's been going on for the whole time, and we're no exception for that today.
I think like in chapter 2 and 3, and Christ addressing each individual church, it's interesting like how each one kind of has like a unique thing kind of given attention to. So like even today you think of like the church as a whole,
Right.
So maybe like the church in China, like in Smyrna, when he talks about like he's going to throw some of them into prison, or there's the church who thought that they were rich, or
Right. There's the affluent church, there's the persecuted church. Absolutely. We see those churches in Revelation. God gave us a wonderful smattering of the kinds of troubles and the kinds of temptations that can befall any church, right? What was your comment, Philip?
Well, no, I guess my comment was what I am reading about today for the church and how it kind of relates to what Revelation is talking about. Yes, in Revelation it's more intense, but in the church right now we're seeing some of this already happening. I guess that was kind of my comment.
Yes, and we are. And of course, we could go back into the history books and find persecution all throughout the church's history, especially seasons of intense persecution in different places around the world. I think you would agree with that.
during the Reformation, and like all the wars.
Right, the Reformation and some of what happened there, and the Anabaptists, and a lot. I mean, there was a lot of suffering. In England, the seasons in England, the English martyrs, those who've lost their lives in the early continent here, like David Brainerd, There were many people, you know, Jim Elliot, even to our century, is kind of that classic example. But we know of many other believers who have lost their lives for Christ, or who, like you said, Philip, have been pushed to the side, who have lost their jobs, who have been ridiculed, who have been whatever. And I think that's exactly what Revelation is how it speaks to us today, is that it encourages us to prepare ourselves for that very thing and calls us to endurance and faith in light of that. That is to not give up and to not give in. To not give up, endurance, to not give in, compromise, right? No compromise, continuing faith in Christ. So I hope that's helpful, you guys. I know it's 8:15 at this point. I would encourage you to text, email me any other questions that you have about that. You can always go online as well and look at the messages, the 37 messages from the study, the teaching, preaching through Revelation that are on our website. If you want to get a little more detail into chapters 12, 13, 14, 17. But notice this, I've got the homework up on the screen. Read Revelation chapters 6 through 11, as well as 15 through 16. 6 through 11, as well as 15 through 16. Asking the question as you read those, what do these chapters tell us about God's judgment against the dragon, the beasts, the prostitute, and all who follow them? Think carefully about, as you're reading, the relationship between the seals, trumpets, and bowls. This is the real kind of skeleton of Revelation. So this will be kind of neat to show you how kind of this is put together a little bit, especially knowing what we know already.